For those who know me, and some of you do, my name is Sasha Poquet. If you want to read up anything I mentioned, you should look up the Alexandra part and the Sasha part. And I'm sorry, I know this is being recorded, but I thought carefully about this. I didn't bring any new things, so things that I'm working on in the last 4 months are not part of this presentation. Things that I have been doing in the last 5 years, more or less, are, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to just kind of show the different things I've done. Maybe they're relevant, maybe they're not. I also didn't structure this talk to go in a very fast pace. So please talk to me about things that you're curious about and interrupt me, because if I do get into my slides, I'm going to go really, really fast, and that's not necessarily interesting. Right, so I currently have 2 affiliations with the center where I came from, to LPI and LPI, and I will talk about the work I've done around different kinds of social architectures in digital settings. And by social architectures, I'm not going to do a lot of conceptual talk, more so different findings from empirical studies, but by social architectures, I mean the relationships between social interactions, social networks, and social relationships that emerge when learning happens in spaces that are technology augmented. So for instance, right now we have a lot of things that are happening in hybrid spaces. So that's a funny space to look at, because we have people who are sitting in space as well as fully online, as well as this cross-cutting modality of both. And so in this setting, we can think of interactions between people, networks, patterns of communications, but as well also force grading towards relationships. So I'm interested in how that develops in a learning environment. And right, I'll present 3 case studies if I manage. And I usually talk about my work as being in the domain of learning analytics. So I'll present the official statement on what that means. And learning analytics is measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts to understand and improve learning and their environments in which it occurs. That's the official definition by the Society for Learning Analytics and Research. What's important to understand that when this was written, it was 2011, LMS wasn't quite huge in many places like it is today. And so when a bunch of people realized that that would be important, that we use the data that LMS collect, again, in 2010, 2011, then they sit down and wrote that definition that we're still using today. So this is about 12 years old, and there's a lot of critique as to whether this actually still holds. To me, it does, but that's why I include the following slide. So roughly speaking, when we talk about learning analytics, to me, that means that research is quantitative. And that it has 3 dimensions. I'll walk through each bit, so you don't have to stress trying to see what's written on the picture or the image. First, images of 2 kids who wear oversized clothes. And the idea is that learning analytics use data that comes from systems that collect data that's not designed for research purposes. So any technology, if it wasn't designed by, let's say, a researcher sitting in a lab, doesn't really produce anything that's useful for learning purposes or understanding learning. And so that's why we work with ready-made data. Working with trace data is not easy, and to me that's one of the critical characteristics of working in learning analytics, because it's basically, you have to do a lot of thinking and processing to be able to relate whatever comes out of the system to any construct or any theory, for that matter, that you need to understand how learning actually happens. The second part, the second image is that we say that we try to measure what matters, okay? But there's this image of this is a famous thing that people do a lot in learning analytics, is that, we only can see what's there, what the light is showing. But the key, the important piece may be somewhere else. And so it's very difficult when you work with digital trace data to remember, consider that we only need to analyze things that impact learning and change of learners, because otherwise we'll be looking at things that are completely useless. And if you use LMS, you know that there's a lot of useless metrics like that don't measure what matters, such as counts that you don't really know what to do with counts, and it's everything. And the last bit that may not be particularly evident if you have never looked at the kind of learning and analytics research there is, but it's that anything that uses visual trace data that is presented offers feedback to a user. right? And many people think of in that terms. And in the last 3 years, learning analytics increasingly looks at what does it mean to present feedback in a way that A is actionable. So for instance, I can tell you something about what you've done as a learner, but you may do nothing with that information simply because it's impossible. So it's important to provide feedback in a manner that a person can act on. So actionability of insight is very important. But also recently people start talking about, well, are these dashboards theoretically designed? What are the sense-making practices around them? So if you heard my chalk talk, that's where my sense-making questions come from, because I work with social activity. I realize that sense-making and social activity is largely unexplored, no matter where you look in terms of when I look at learning settings. Okay, so yeah, and there's a lot of prediction work. So we've done this analysis of all the paper, because it's only 10 years of conference, it's 12 now. We've looked at everything, what was the purpose of analysis in learning analytics, and most of it is that people try, so the fraction of papers on the x-axis and years over time, and you see everybody tries to predict or build something. So predicting analytics, building new systems, a very little understanding of what actually is being analyzed. So I'm more on the understanding part than the predictive part. But there's very good predictive analytics research as well. So if you're interested in that, just ask, because there are very good examples, particularly around, for instance, capturing biases that are embedded within the prediction models. Right. And so I could write 2 big studies, but then I thought it would be really bad if I don't talk about MOOCs, because I spent my entire PhD working on MOOCs, and a lot of my highly cited papers are actually in this area. And I don't talk about talked about MOOCs in the last 5 years, but I was at this research visit last week, and somebody made a very silly comment about MOOCs, and I was reminded that many people that I didn't do a good enough work explaining what I found, and that I sometimes still get very annoyed when people tell me about MOOCs things that they have never really validated in any empirical evidence, because everybody saw what MOOCs look like. So I thought I'd talk a bit about that. So I did my PhD and then a bunch of other things related, looking at whether communities and MOOCs can happen. And you may say, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because we have tons of literature in educational spaces where we know how to facilitate an online class with 30 people. We also have tons of literature that talks about how communities form on the internet, open communities. Now, MOOCs is neither of these things. And that's where the research space is, because it is not a class, but it is a class in a way. It has some constraints that constrain how learners interact and come together. But it also is open-ended boundaries with groups that evolve, which means that it has these properties of both things, of both being a bounded course and an open space. So I spent a lot of time looking at very simple indicators of MOOCs. I'm not going to tell you what I've done, like this is a lot of stuff. I'll tell you what I found. So I found that yes, you can communities and MOOCs to develop. And if anybody tells you that, oh, but MOOCs have low social activity, don't believe that. It's not necessarily true. Some MOOCs are poorly designed, yes, but also very poorly designed MOOCs can have communities and very vibrant, active social activity, even better than an online course. On average, an online community in a MOOC, the active part of this group will be more people who will be interacting more actively than a smaller group in an online course. Okay, that's been my experience looking at the different cases.
When you say the MOOC can be poorly designed or well designed, is it the content or the platform or both?
Or neither, actually. Platform always constraints, regardless of what you do. No platform is perfect. This goes back to the debate that it depends on which MOOCs we're talking about. So it's about a pedagogy of teaching in distributed spaces. So in 2008, there were examples of innovative pedagogies, so that's connectivist pedagogies, where you don't have a platform, you have spaces, and then you have an aggregator that links things together. And then there are open-ended pedagogies such as learners self-defined curriculum. So that was cutting-edge work in 2008. 900 people on Twitter, blogging, very, very rich stuff. And then in 2011, Silicon Valley decided that they know how to do big courses, so they took what they knew from an online classroom, a caustic, inflexible online platform, threw videos with quizzes in it, which is basically pedagogies from about 30 to 40 years before, okay? But it's scaled, it's still scaled, you can scale content. My research shows that you can have activity in both. It depends on a whole bunch of different things. But I was really trying to understand to what extent it's possible empirically, because people would just dismiss it. But if you start reading through like an active MOOC, you're like, I don't really think this is bad. I mean, it's just, so I wanted the numbers, I've seen some numbers. I explained the way MOOCs form as a multi-level structure, where you have a core group of people that can vary in size, could be 100 people, could be 30 people, but they will have extremely high interactions with one another. So magnitude of several hundred times. Not counts several hundred times. And then you can have up to several thousand others who will just be having less frequent interactions of once or twice with one another. An average online course that's not very specially designed will have about 5 interactions between 2 learners. Okay? So, no, but there are these 2 levels, and they're very discrete. And what I've shown in the studies is that the patterns that describe the core and periphery are really, really different. So the core has different perceptions on everything, of social presence, cognitive presence in the course. So these are active folks. Their network structure is different. And they also have different kinds of posts that they make. Okay, there's a lot of negotiation around values of what matters to them. While all the periphery folks, they really have a completely different patterns of the kind of posts they make. Doesn't mean that they're not important or cognitively interesting. They're just all content. Okay, there's no social there whatsoever, and it's always different duration, the patterns of like fluctuate and vary. So it's completely 2 different levels. Yeah. And what I haven't done with MOOCs, so I thought I mentioned that because maybe that's interesting to somebody, is that what I haven't been able to do, because I moved on to other things, was to understand the relationship between these 2 layers. Because my hypothesis from what I've seen is that actually you can't say that the active guys are more important than the guys who participate less. I think that the combination of them in the beginning provides impetus for the creation of the core, and then the guys who just jump in and out all the time with a little bit of content who are like peripheral, they're actually very important for driving the creation of the core. So you can't say that it's just the active guys who matter and we should only cater to them. Now, another thing that I found was the mechanisms for the community formations were different from the one in an online course. So in an online course in a classroom, if I want a community with 30 people, I'm going to work with mechanisms of what's called bond-based community. In other words, I want people to know each other's names and like be good buddies. So that's a bond-based relationship. Mechanism is dyadic. While in an online space with these MOOC communities, the mechanism is what's called interest-based community. So the affiliation is via the shared interest. So as long as the person thinks these guys value the same things as I do, doesn't need to know everybody, doesn't need to know anybody for that matter. As long as this person thinks they value the same thing, they create ardent self-identification mechanism and engage. So it's important because you can kick out a person in a bond-based environment. If I take somebody who's extremely important, like Dula, who is struggling with a Monday, it will be like, and everybody who's friends with Dula is going to leave because they're only here because of him, because it's bonds-based community. Well, if it's an interest-based community, we're all here because we value science so much. It doesn't matter who leaves, because you're not here because of any specific individual, which means that technological solutions, pedagogical solutions should account for this. So this was my sort of understanding of MOOC settings based on what I've seen with the digital data. As I said, there's more to point specifically empirically, so we can talk if that's of interest.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
When you were talking about learning analytics, you were showing these kids with the big dresses.
Yeah.
How easy or difficult was to find the right data to analyze?
So edX platform, which I used edX and Coursera MOOCs, we use JSON files, so all the trace data, everything that they say, when they say it. The difficult part was to just do a lot of descriptives for me at that time, to understand that I should be looking at different levels. And also to understand how to cut the levels. Because as a qualitative researcher, because I came from a qualitative paradigm when I started, I could see that there were differences. But to me, 5 is as good as 7. But it's not generalizable, right? So it took me a while to figure out how you can do that in a way that would be replicable, and so we've done some applications on different platforms and things like that. So doing a lot of qualitative work and developing a conceptual view that I validated through a set of empirical studies. So we're talking about 7 papers here altogether. So it's really a vast body of research. That's why I don't talk about it, because it's a lot. Okay, second study. So this one builds on the work I've done with Mark in 2020, which I consider, the work I've done with Mark and Luba, I consider the most interesting thing I've ever worked on so far in terms of impact. Unfortunately, not everybody understands that in my community, so I take it upon myself to explain it when I can, so please bear with me, I'll dwell on it. But its importance only comes through when I talk about the application of it. So I'm not going to tell you much about what I've done in the paper, but I'll tell you what I've done afterwards with the paper I've written with the three fellows. Right, so this particular analysis is done on exactly the same data that we use with Mark and Luba, 20 courses, one school, so it's a school in an Australian university, covers about 600 students. So we're talking about online and blended courses, so like normal classes. Students, I think it was master's students, all the master's courses. And basically the question I was wondering about, and I had wondered about this question for a long time, and I couldn't really find anything, or I just like really see that clearly until we developed that framework with Mark and Luba. And so bear with me, this is a little bit boring, but it is very important. When you take stuff from digital platform, log data, like I say something, Ignacio replies, Myra replies to Ignacio, Tim says something as well, but he doesn't talk in the same discussion as we do somewhere else. So we have this build-up of who talks to whom. And usually what people have done in the past, they would take this and build a network, because of course who talks to whom is a network, right? And then they would run social network analysis on it. I'm going to use social network analysis here to indicate that this means that people rely heavily on social science theories of centralities, meaning of centralities, like if Ignacio is going to be the guy who's going to be central in all these conversations, then he's most powerful, most central actor. Interpretation of these metrics, basically, would be driven by social science research. And people would do that, like, pretty much if you randomly pick a paper that does network analysis of digital setting, that's what you do. And I've been trying to understand what it would look like if we take these kind of things in relation to the course design, like do particular pedagogical designs, facilitate particular social structures, because relationship formation matters, because relationships help students learn, etc., etc. And it was all over the place. I couldn't find patterns. I mean, I could, but then they wouldn't replicate. It was just really not very nicely, it was a frustrating process. When we worked with Mark and Luba, we have done something different. We said, well, what if it's not us talking to one another, but just us posting. So the baseline activity is just individual posts. It's not networks of people, it's networks of posts where we can control for individual activity. So it's not about me selecting to talk to Ignacio only because he's in the same discipline, very close to my research, and I don't talk to you because you are in a practice department, or something like that, right? So I don't select people online, but more like I just come in and say things because I'm there to say something, because I'm required to, because I'm interested, etc. And if we use individual activity as a null model, then we can evaluate and have basically an understanding whether the group structure that comes from the null model is different than the one that we are observing on a network level. So I'm sorry I'm going to be difficult about this, but does it make sense what I just said? To whom it doesn't, I know it does, but I presume to most people it doesn't.
I'm not sure how you make the network out of the individual.
Right, so think of it as
individual postings.
Right. If people talk to people, if people post, then we have a network of posts.
Sure. Then you know who posted in the same thread, and you know.
That doesn't really matter. It depends. What matters is that you can control so that some posts collect more.
Because they reply to the post.
How are posts linked to each other?
Yeah,
What are I just connecting the if the nodes are posts, what are the edges?
Yes.
Sequence of reply within the structure of the thread. So I just said that, you just replied to me, you kind of replied to him, you kind of replied to me. So let's
Okay,
just.
so if one post is a reply to a different post, they're connected by an edge.
Right, but they are connected, they're separate nodes even if they are done by the same person.
Okay.
Which is important, because you control for the properties of the post rather than the person. And then from that, you aggregate that to who talked to whom. And
And how do you account for people reading but not posting?
you don't. That's extra. That's a lot more involved than what we've done. We've done something super simple. We just said, let's control for, how active people are, how active posts are and how popular posts are. So let's control the simplest metrics that we can and see how well that will reproduce the observed. And it reproduces extremely well.
Yeah, no, the question was, but this might be just a caveat, but what if, like the person initial post, a few replies, and then another person replies, but as a new post? You can't take that into account.
No, you can't. It's going to be a separate node,
Right, okay.
right? What's important about it is that the new model does something that talks about individual activity level. But then when you aggregate it to the network level, you can say this person is central. And what we show is that when we just build the simplest node model that controls for individuals' activity, basically, we have structures, network structures that show very similar patterns than the ones that are observed. In other words, in learning analytics, people say if you have high degree, that means you have high social capital. It's a measure of social something. We say in our study that we've written, we say, well, actually, it's just a measure of your activity. There's nothing to do with your social anything. You'd get that if you control for individual properties. So it's not me selecting to talk to you. It's just me talking so much that I managed to talk to so many people. But it's not because I have any reason for that. It's just activity. And so if you want to capture social, you have to do something else. And so then we looked at these patterns in the middle using the new model. And then because now you have the distribution of random networks, you can actually derive the third level. So that's something we didn't do in that original study, but you basically derive the backbone structure from the communication pattern because you know which ties are more frequent than by chance. Yes.
The question, is there a hierarchy on whether you initiate a post or whether you reply to a post and whether you
Yes, we
say something interesting or if you just say great?
there was no control for content, so that's future work, standard work to be done in that domain, right? But we did control for the post that opens and the post that closes, so that, because there's something about them that. So we didn't control for content explicitly, but implicitly there were some controls that did that. But again, I think it's important that because it was not at the level of the person, it kind of has a little bit of flexibility as to how these networks unfold. But discourse is so far, and I will show that when I get to the end of this talk, it's most important. Plus the design.
So you did this on still on MOOC data? Or?
No, this is the 3,200 people classes, online classes.
This is online classes.
Online classes. So different data sets, similar data structures, but different setup. And so then, because you have all this, like you have this 3-level technique, you can see the top patterns for relationships. And I'll show now that when you do that, then I've done some ergms on it on the top there. If you don't know, ergm is basically, it's just a statistical model that shows what parts of relationships are more prominent in the network. But the point is that all the ergms that you've done before would be done at this level. Everybody would just analyze this level as if this is like everything we've got. Well, in this study, I don't do that. I don't do it at the top level. And so when I do that, then the patterns kind of emerge. Well, this is the picture I should have just shown you before, but it doesn't matter. So this is the post network. This is the learner to learner. And see, this is the edge that's kind of like more frequent because I have a null model. I can say, well, this is more frequent than by chance, while all these other ones are random. So this is like a macro relationship network. sort of this kind of logic. And, right. So that's taking care of the structures of how the networks form. The other pile of work was how do we actually analyze pedagogical designs. That's really, really non-trivial because it's basically impossible to know how the instructors plan their courses, especially when you want to design a methodology that will scale, because you can't interview them. They do whatever they like. And in Moodle or even like MOOCs, it doesn't matter, all this data that, like the traces that we get from what the instructors were doing, extremely difficult to interpret. Basically, right now, there's only one study I can think of that's done that more or less well. But it's done on MOOCs, so that doesn't mean that it would hold in any of the online settings. So what I've done here was different. I thought, well, what if we ignore the pedagogical design, but try to capture something that every course will have and can be compared. So what if we look at indicators of forums, because forums where everybody talks on in a course, at the level of posting. So what if we kind of count the number of times everybody posts, because you can do that in every course. It tells you something about the level of activity in a forum without necessarily telling what the teacher did, but you know that whatever the teacher did had a lot of posting or a little bit of posting, so it kind of like ignores the teacher but looks at the posting activity and tries to understand or interpret it in relation to the design. And so basically there's this kind of metrics that would, like you can do it in any course, metrics like total number of posts in the forum, number of posts in the largest discussion, total discussions, average per person, post to reply ratio, percentage of posts without reply, depth of discussion, so like that would be the turn taken of the discussion, so not the length, not all the posts that are in there, but more like the levels. And ultimately, what you can see, but what happens when you calculate these on the course level and you put them in a like a simple clustering algorithm or use PCA, so some pretty standard metrics, it falls into that kind of shows some where you have the dimension of high and low participation, individual participation, and high and low interactivity. And so I further described these 4 courses because it's very difficult to talk about all of them, just 4 sort of strongly pronounced that have high personal participation, so I post a lot, as well as high interactivity. And I interact, and not only I, but others interact with a lot of people. Then you can have, so participation high-low, high-low. I'll talk about specific prompts, because that's basically, because I chose 4 architects, there's also the type of activities instructors use in a forum for these, so it was easier to talk about these guys. So for instance, a forum that has high participation, so a lot of people post a lot, and low interactivity, meaning that people on average don't talk to each other a lot, would have the prompt in this particular one example of the cluster, would be the prompt, share what you read. You know, I don't know if you've seen any of these things, but then instructors who don't know what to do, they often like that. Tell us, discuss this reading from week 1. That's the prompt. Do something with this reading. And so when that prompt happens, what happens is that you have a lot of people just saying what they read, but a little bit, not much interactivity. Now, not much doesn't mean no interactivity at all. It's important, because I thought that was really bad, it isn't. Then you have courses where people are put in small groups and they walk throughout, so that would be high participation and higher interactivity, both. Then you'd have courses where people have high participation, low participation and high interactivity. So that's a one where people say you have to respond to at least 2 or 3 other people, provide feedback to 2 or 3 other people. And what happens there is that everybody talks to everybody on average, but kind of the general level of individual activity is low because people don't really have much to say beyond that interactivity. And then sometimes instructors do nothing, so you see nothing. So if you don't want to have a forum, then you can name time. That's a solution.
Yeah, Sasha.
Yeah.
Do you have the information of if the post came from the teacher?
Yes. And in this data set, we do control for it. And I don't have that information in the follow-up study, which is unfortunate, because then the clustering doesn't go in the same way. Yes. I don't remember now which one has more of the teacher. I don't remember. But I think this has highest teacher involvement, because teachers still post. This doesn't, it's very low, but they all kind of the same number of average posting individual. And collaborative has sometimes, but it's like a TA making sure that the groups work well. So it's not, this one would have higher average involvement than from the teacher. What's quality to be labeled? It's not easy to, because we knew the names of all the TAs. And so everybody who was in staff, we knew there. So we've derived using this methodology indicators at posting levels and also macro level. So what I'll present now is the network structures that describe these 4 types of forum kind of activity. Okay. So what you have here is that the first one, but it's important, this comes from the 3rd level. Okay, these patterns that make a lot of sense when you look at them. They don't come from the middle level. I have spent a lot of time looking for them in the middle level. They're not there. You can't. They're too noisy. There's a lot of different things. But if you look at the top level, there's a lot more clarity because we have a new model that isn't perfect, but still it allows for cleaning up the noise to an extent that the patterns are really different.
When you're saying in the model to clean, it's just like showing the overrepresented nodes, the links.
Exactly. But you don't know which ones.
Yeah.
Unless you have a mechanism. Exactly. So what you see here, nothing is nothing, right? That's kind of nice. That's easy. Nothing is nothing. Let's talk about the first 2 because they're also kind of simple. I don't know how well you see the yellow and the blue on the screen there, but the first one looks like a lot of small clustered graphs that are subnetwork parts that are not talking to one another besides being linked through the TA. These guys are the ones, so that's the one that's collaborative groups. The second one is the one talk to at least 2 or 3 people. It's almost like a random graph really, because they just randomly reply to people who are there. And the edge weight here is low, here it's highest, both and closure would be more prominent in that network. In fact, that would be the only network where I can fit closure and anergum. That I know writing would understand me. So, yeah. But and right. But so to me, this one is most interesting. Number 3, because I always thought that was the kind of like a single way of telling people what to do socially. Post something that you read. But what happens is that if you look at this actually resembles preferential attachment better than anything else. In a way, what you can see there is that it kind of, this network, because imagine, right, people just post things that they find interesting, and what happens is that others naturally reply to whatever they find interesting as well. And so what you have group formation. And there the edge weight and clustering do exist. They're just not as high as here. And of course, the overall sort of equality of who talks to whom will be highest here and will be lower here. But it doesn't, this is an interesting network because it's more natural in terms of how it unfolds. It allows for strong connections and weak connections. It allows for some group formation as well as some just, lurking and looking and things like that. And so an interesting question to me that comes from this is, okay, well, really these are, there's not like this is better than the other. The reality is that you need to figure out in which order they should happen to facilitate sometimes that everybody talks to everybody and sometimes sort of more interpersonal, deeper connections. And when that should happen within the entire student program, because right now analysis we do at the course level, not at the program level, not at the year level. So that was the findings. 34 minutes, this is I have another case. I will keep it right.
How does that compare if you analyze the Reddit forum or something not class related? Or like
I don't know because I don't particularly
flow or some other discussion.
I can tell you where my intuition is that this would be more like that, but I haven't done the work, so it's a hypothesis.
Just curious, what does the context do to the interaction online?
Well, that's what it does, right? This is what it does. But this one where you have nothing, people just have to say something. And so to me, that's similar to what you do on Stack Overflow. You need something, and so it's need driven. And here it's interest driven. That's how I would interpret this formation. Yes, Mark. Okay.
Yes, Sasha. I had one remark on this slide. So it's great. So something we said in the paper around the paper is that null models that take into account the activities are very good at reproducing local metrics such as degree, right? But they get worse when they have to predict higher order metrics, like more global metrics, such as triadic closure, like triangles, or community detection. And here's something actually, you don't talk so much actually about the triads, so you talk about the dyads. But what I find interesting is that the case on the left is kind of localized triads or localized cluster, and probably maybe allowing some focus around the discussion points. And the more you go on the right, the more you distribute the triangles. You still have triangles, but you kind of begin to distribute them and interrelate them. So I don't know if there's something that you have looked also on that aspect, like the clustering aspect.
So if you remember when we talked, one of the methods we suggested in the paper was using weighted triads. And so we use the weights here in deriving these structures, and I think that controls sort of for that issue. The first one, with the first image there, groups were predefined, so people weren't allowed to leave the group. So it's not like they converged on conversation, but there were, so the block modeling would basically, which is also something we talk about in the paper. So I think I hear what you say, but I'm not 100% sure that it would apply to all the cases. I think to some, but like this first case, it's not like people found each other and they then talked in small groups. They were assigned small groups and they talked in small groups.
I see. Okay. So it's per design. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly, by design, which is what Dula asked, which is, what does design do to these things?
Yeah, can you remind me what this data set is? Like, is it for a specific MOOC or a specific?
Online courses.
It's online courses, right?
Yeah, so just normal university classes.
I guess, do you have a slicing about like the kind of course? Because I could imagine that the interactions work differently in a biology course versus a mathematics.
These are very similar discipline-wise. They're different disciplines within the same domain. So social sciences.
Okay.
So you don't have STEM discussions there, which would have somewhat different categories.
Okay.
I was going to ask the course question as well. And the geographical location?
Very homogeneous. I can't tell you. Well, right, they're all in the same place, but distant. So it's an online discussion. They don't have class interactions.
Which country?
Australia.
You say interactions, it does not include reactions. Like it's really text-based interactions.
Yeah, it doesn't include like emoji slides and things like that because it's Moodle.
Yeah. Okay.
Australia is an interesting example, isn't it? Because it's got a long history of distance teaching, not just online teaching, because of the vastness of the country, the strong agricultural community from primary school all the way up to. So these are students who are used to learning.
No, these are graduate students who just finished, the average age.
Are they Australian majority?
But they're not more used to it than.
But did you manage to identify those that grew up in the rural communities of Australia that learned radio? Because obviously there's a lot of primary and secondary school teaching in Australia like radio.
Sure. No, we didn't look at that.
Are they synchronous classes?
No. So it's all distance courses.
But this is an asynchronous or? So in the sense that
There's no video conferencing. It is just content and a forum.
Okay.
Do they have to finish by deadlines though? Like
Sometimes, but not all the time.
Okay.
Did you try removing the TA from the network and what does that do?
Not in here. I don't know. Not in this. Not in this set. In the other set. and then it depends on the pedagogy. So, and it depends on the TA. So in a MOOC data set, there were courses where TA were extremely important because they over-moderate, so they don't allow the networks to form close. There's not quantitative because the TA just closes all the conversation very fast. So that kind of can detect. For instance, that would have a different implication by somebody who's just every now and then posting something on whatever. It depends. But we didn't do that here.
You've got me really thinking about my own teaching.
Yeah.
Because they're talking about examples where the TA has been sort of removed. I've found myself where I've been removed by the student. So sometimes places where I've done the prompting, and typically, it's very embarrassing. And then there've been no responses, and then sort of like a week later saying to the student, well, why haven't you responded? They said, well, we've been working, but we created a WhatsApp group.
Right.
To answer your question. I said, well, why are you using a WhatsApp group rather than the forum? This is because we're more used to this and it's easier. But I have no access to that. Yeah, probably. That's why they think. But they've been doing, I've seen the results then. Once when I'm in contact with them, I see the results that they've actually been working on the question, but not through the LMS board.
So all of these are valid concerns, right? Do online spaces predominantly the places for student communication? Do we need teachers in there? All of that is good to us. Now, to remind you, I'm coming to this from the learning analytics point of view, which is there is an instructor who can do something in an LMS that has been thrown down to that person from the university administration, right? So how to measure what's happening to be able to inform the instructor about the kind of relationships that are forming through their pedagogical activity. So it's not to dismiss all of these things because like, that's, for instance, what I'm doing right now, right? I'm taking a very different end goal to what I'm working right now than what I was doing there. Exactly for these reasons, because there are always points where I think impact may be better and stronger. But it doesn't mean that the instructor can't act on this. I do have one, it's 42 minutes. Should I stop or should I continue? All right, because I just want to talk briefly about this that we've done, because it's painful and disappointing, and it's the largest study that I've done, but I also think that the findings are kind of interesting. So we looked at data from 3 universities, American University, Australian University, and Asian University, large universities, 4 years of data, otherwise same kind of data, online courses in a university, this time not exclusively online, also blended, can't always differentiate. Blended means you go to class and you talk to some peers and then you have to interact online as well, that's blended. Online is you never see peers, you just work online. So 4 years, one cohort, so it's not all students, but students who started in a particular year and we just tracked them over 4 years. So there are more students there, but we just looked at one particular cohort over 4 years. So we're talking about the data from about 14,000 students. And I mean, basically what I was interested in is this question. In a lot of learning analytics studies, they say, oh, we analyzed this forum data and these 2 people talked to one another and their grades were similar. So we have high performers talking there and low performers talking there. And so there's a bit of research like that. And it would usually be based on one course. So they say, we will see in online communication that high performers select to talk to one another. And I was curious whether they really select, whether there's something else happening. So the original intention was to look at homophily, so similarity of performance between 2 people in an online communication network, and see whether it is me choosing to talk to you. So we are saying we are both top A students and I choose to talk to you, so we form, and then everybody else who joins us also is the same. Or whether it's influence, so for instance, I'm a B student, you're an A student, we talk, and then I become an A student because you're such a wonderful teacher. So that was the original question. I'm just going to move through this and say, well, it was neither. Well, it was a little bit of selection, just a little bit of no influence. But what was interesting about this study, this was the least interesting part of it. What was interesting was that on average, there's a lot of homophily on performance in the forums. So that exemplifies two ego networks. The way you read it is this is a student, so this is me, and these are like accumulated connections of people who I talk to in one forum and their performance. So 12% of I'm a bottom, so I'm a D student. I'm bottom 25% of performance. 12% of my network are top performers. 47% of my ego network are the same as me. And 24 are just a little bit better. So in other words, about 60 to 70% of who I talk to are either just like me or slightly better. And you'd see exactly the same pattern on every one of them. So you don't have to look at the top performer, it's going to be very similar. Is that most of the interaction an individual learner has are going to be with people who have just the same performance or slightly different. Now, what's the slightly? The slightly is, this is an example of 18 pairs of students, 1,800 pairs of students. So this one shows that the average difference between two people talking to one another is a little bit higher than one standard deviation. And this year, standard deviation was 0.5 a grade. So it's like I'm A and you're A plus. Okay, that's the average difference. It doesn't mean I only talk with A plus students, but the amount of A plus students or A students in my network is really a lot. And so despite of all the trouble I had with the data comparing between the different platforms, 3 universities, we couldn't merge it together, everybody had to do it separately, all of that. But this was the pattern that sort of pulled across the data. And so the question was why? Because in the first analysis, we could see it wasn't social processes, okay? It was something else. And so in a second study on this, I've done some shuffling. So usually to build a network, you have student, GPA, post ID, thread ID, timestamp, course. So I create a bunch of different models where I shuffle these characteristics to see which one of these properties would basically create a bigger discrepancy in observed homophily. And unsurprisingly, but it was surprising to me because I thought it was timing. My second hypothesis was it's not social, it's timing. It's because I'm there at the same time as you. We're very prepared for the deadline. We're there on Monday, we both did, we interacted, and whoever comes on Friday, they have nothing to talk about because we've already talked. But I was wrong. So timing, and what else do we have? Time per course, shuffling of the threads, very similar, random, very similar to the observed the biggest effect had the distribution of who's enrolled in the course.
Oh, what, sorry?
Of who's enrolled in the course. Well, because the homophily is calculated on the grades, right? So you have 3 people in the course, and let's say it's a physics course, so only very sort of selective mechanisms for getting in there. So you have a particular distribution of grades in that. And so shuffling the grades as to who is enrolled in which course perturbates this observed pattern of homophily the most. In other words, if people were enrolled in a different manner, or put in course enrollment patterns in a different manner, we would see a change in this observed homophily based on performance. But because it's very difficult to actually change the enrollment patterns in the course, you can't really do much about it. But what you can change, and that is actually more possible to change, is the distribution of who posts in the forum, because not everybody does. And so this is my attempt to illustrate this. I don't know how well done this image is, but this is not the course performance distribution, but forum performance distribution. And so there's a difference, right? Let's say all of us are enrolled in a course, and we put our grades and distribution, it will be normal. But only 5 of us post. which means the distribution of posts is not necessarily the same as the distribution of the enrollment. And so what this plot captures is the different courses. I think this is just 30 courses. And so these are the, what do you call it, 21st, 50th, 75th percentile and interquartile range of the distributions. And you can see that some courses have distributions of the GPA. So they are very different in terms of how they're skewed and who's posting and things like that. And so and so when I just took these metrics of what's the mean grade of the poster in a forum, what's the range of the grades of posters in a forum, and tried to predict this similarity, the difference between our grades in that same forum. These metrics predict up to 40% of, the R squared of those models is 0.4, which is extremely high for the kind of research I do, which sometimes you can, so some of the reviewers said to me, well, it's obvious, of course, the grades explain the homophoby of the grades. Yes, but that's not what we've written in a bunch of other studies before, because we said, well, high performers select. They don't select, nobody selects. People just in a forum because of what the instructor does or doesn't do, which is what defines the distribution. Because if you tell everybody you're going to be graded on what you post, everybody will post, and so the distribution will be different, and the number of opportunities to interact with different people will be different. If you do nothing, then maybe only the lower performance will come in and say, hey, where's the deadline, where's the syllabus? Oh, it's here. So you have homophily and low performance. Or maybe you have a super hard class where the instructor did nothing about explaining assessment, and so your high performers are just spamming the forum saying, I don't know how to solve this quiz, and so you have a lot of homophily and high performance, for instance.
However, were the consequentiality of the course as well as interest levels ever factored in? Because I was imagining that.
No.
Okay.
No. It's very difficult to do that because we're talking about.
But they may make a lot of difference in how much you want to get out of.
Oh, that I did. So here, that by year in a cohort, that I've done. I mean, for every year, it decreases over time. The homophily decreases over time. Not on all courses, it's very difficult. It's not like this is a steady trend, okay? But yeah.
So this, I'm guessing this data is anonymized from somewhere. Do you have the trajectory of the students across classes and years, or do you not?
It's the information isn't there. I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, but the information isn't there.
Like it would be very interesting given your like homophily and posting, right? Like, do you see that you have sort of like switches that might happen in students where like, you know, suddenly like they were in a high performance forum, dense or forum rich environment, and then that sort of changed them for the rest, you know, like is this like a in fiction permanent effect of like, you know, I've learned how to work now so I can continue working?
It's in the data. I don't know if it's for the okay. So I'll explain why in a second. So the last thing I've done with this was to then look at remember those forums, like number of posts and post reply ratio describing the course and things like that. So I had like a descriptor of I added those metrics in there and tried to classify the different types of courses. This is on the, it's probably better to show the table, but this is done on analysis of 600 courses where we cluster homophily in the course and the distribution of posters and the different sort of features describing the forum. So this is 1 year in one university, but I have tried replicating this on another year. So that is 2016. I've done exactly the same thing on 2017. It shows very similar patterns, which is why I kind of think, okay, well, I can replicate that because I at least tried a little bit. Right, so there's some patterns as to like what instructors do on a forum versus what the distribution of who's posting looks like. And I think that the way for me, this is the end of this research very much because I think, okay, well, we can show instructors simple indicator. This is the distribution of who's posting in your class changing. It's very simple. Simple to teach people to do something about it. Things you're talking about are interesting phenomena. My concern would be that the data is really good for showing these things, because as was pointed out, that's not where the students mostly interact. And so that's why I came here, design research that collects data that has nothing to do with learners, but controls for activity and all sorts of things outside, and looks at similarities and differences between people and these formational structures. Because I've had enough of this, and it's good questions. But I spent 2 years on this, and I just, it's like you look and you look and you look, and then you say, okay, digital traces are fine, but there needs to be something that we need to add to that. But because of this, I think that the fact that there's so much homophily is kind of scary, because this data comes pre-COVID. So those kids actually had other opportunities to interact with one another. Now during COVID times, whoever's in your class, that's it. So if you're talking about building relationships and building social capital, then you can ask questions, well, the instructors can say it's none of my business, right? Because it's their personal stuff. But it is, to some extent. When the instructor is facilitating these activities and the course forms, that's all you get there. So I'll stop there. It's been 55 minutes. I am very happy I've made it that far. And you have too. Yes.
On a practical question, would you then say that it's more recommendable to force the instructor to create the groups or allow the students to create their own groups? Is it better to have homophily or is it worse to have homophily?
This is an excellent research question, which is why what I'm doing at with LPI looks at the relationship between similarity and difference in your encounters in relation to the learning outcome. Because there are two separate piles of research. One says, if you encounter people, well, let me rephrase that. If you have friends that are similar to you, it's good for you. Okay, we talk about career choices, for instance, female in STEM, career choices. But there is also a lot of learning science research that shows that if you interact with peers who have different levels of cognitive ability, then your learning can be enhanced. But learning science meta-analyses show conflicting evidence as to when it is good for what kind of groups. Different performance bands develop or perform differently or respond differently to being put with similar and different others. My hypothesis is that it's a combination of the two things, that you have to have students who are different from who you are, but not too different. Which is why what we see online is this proximity is simply because that's as much as they can connect. Because if it's too far away, it's too different. And then there is this other similarity on other demographic factors that I presume is also there. So I think there's an optimal balance between the two. And again, the instructors, I mean, right now, sure, I can point you to one paper and say one thing, and other people will say another thing. To me, the timing and sequencing of these things matters. So like with these 4 networks that I've shown, right, which one's better? I would argue, I would hypothesize, if I build an experiment about it tomorrow, I'll say, let's do the random one first, opposed to any 2 people, because everybody needs everybody. But then maybe let's do small groups, and then do different small groups, and then have preferential attention. So we have all 4 that allow progression from I need everybody, I need intimately just some people, and then there is interest-driven relationship formation in the later years where people kind of know where they're going. I don't know whether that's actually false for their development, but that would be something that I would think might be true, maybe.
If you're designing on-campus pastoral care tutorial sessions, these aren't tutorials as in small groups, teaching groups, but accompanying students, whatever difficulties they might be encountering following their classes. What works best is when they design their own groups. Not necessarily who they're with, but what the subject matter is going to be discussed. Yeah. And when I say what works best, it's purely attendance. There's no necessarily correlation with results or grades. And when it comes to social interaction, I'm going to say that it's vitally important. And I suppose from management level, what we always try to do is make sure that students can multiply the number of communities that they belong to, so people have close interests, whether they're personal interests, subject matter interests, and try to diversify belonging in that way.
Right, but except all of this now has somehow to move to the digital,
Exactly.
largely
But
digital.
which was interesting when you were right at the beginning, you were mentioning bond associations and
Right.
interest. Of course, on campus, we try, this is why we give so much importance to student society. We want students to create interest groups, belong to interest, because there's some recognition of the importance that has for belonging and therefore for integrating their study groups. And then you have to move that online.
You don't have to move that online. I think one of the things that people have found is that online requires a design. You don't, you know, when we say we have to move this online, the assumption is somehow that we have a good practice in face-to-face and we're replicating it. But what we found so much is that that's not necessarily the best thing to do. You have to understand the importance of the different parts and redesign the thing for the space where it's happening. So virtual is not, the mechanisms, the principles might be similar, but thinking has to evolve beyond where it's consequences.
The question of mediation remains an important one, and trying to address issues that fight against students that find themselves isolated when they're purely distant students is a important issue.
Yeah. If any questions, you know where to find me.